So I'm Max Carmichael. I'm a, it's interesting. One of my elders years ago, he said, Max, you're a seeker. You're just a seeker. You're always going to be a seeker. You're never going to find what you're looking for. You're a seeker. And of course, that hit me pretty hard, especially when he said I wasn't going to find what I was looking for. Um, but I absorbed it, and I realized, going back through my past life, that if you had to sum it up in one word, that's as good as any. Um, I've just been endlessly curious, and I've worked out my curiosity through the arts, particularly music, painting and drawing and writing, storytelling. I come from a storytelling tradition in the Appalachians, but I also have this problematic skill set in math and the sciences. And so, like I was telling you yesterday, I've always had this tension between the left brain and the right brain, the part of me that wants to be super analytical and the part of me that wants to be super intuitive and expressive and so forth. So as I've gone through life, I've explored society, I've explored culture, and I've explored nature. I grew up in nature, in the foothills of the Appalachians, spending every minute that I could outdoors and learning about plants and animals and so forth. And so that ultimately led me through school, and then to San Francisco, where I turned out to be there roughly the same time as you were, at the time when there was a revolution going on in culture, at least in youth culture, what we thought of as underground culture, apart from the mainstream. And it was an incredibly exciting time. It inspired me to start my own loft. I started a band, and the people I was meeting tangentially led me out to the Mojave Desert. And I had such a magical experience when I first went to the Mojave Desert that it was like, it was literally falling in love at first sight. It was a love affair that turned out to be far more productive and long lasting than any of my human love affairs. So the desert, it felt like my place. It felt like my home, even though I'd grown up in this sort of lush, these river valleys back east, that were just overwhelming with abundant vegetation and so forth. And then I end up in this desert. It's mostly rock. It's really stark. But that's where I felt at home for the first time in my life. And so I wanted to know everything about it. And as I was camping out there with my girlfriend in the early years, we started finding artifacts. And then we were shown by some of our scientist friends, we were shown what is normally called rock art, pictographs and petroglyphs. And so we thought, holy shit, we're, I'm sorry, but we're in this place that most people would consider uninhabitable. Most white people, most Anglos would consider uninhabitable. And there were people not only living out here, but they were making art, living off the land and being creative. And so that led me to study of prehistoric cultures, and then to the living Native Americans who formerly inhabited the place where we were camping. And it just turned into this quest that went on for decades. And I'm still, I'm still a novice. I'm still a total ignoramus. I'm just some white kid who's in love with all of these things and incredibly curious about them. I'm learning more and more. I'll always be a student. So that's my story in a tiny nutshell.
Well, and you kind of anchored down into your homeland there. You bought some property up in the mountains. Could you tell us about that?
Yeah. Yeah. When we were camping out there, we we met people from the University of California that were managing an ecological reserve, and and they were actually living out there full time. We were commuting from the city. You know, we were living in San Francisco, and we were driving out to the desert a couple times a year, camping out. And so I started to get the idea of, well, you know, maybe at some point I could live out here, and maybe I could have my own place out here. So we started looking, or I started looking into land ownership. All the land in that particular area where we had been camping was either federal land, public land, or university land. But talking to our friends at the university, I learned that there was another mountain range to the south that was supposedly really beautiful, and it had a lot of private land. And they told me about somebody that they had met down there that might know more about it. So one thing led to another, and it was about 8 years after I fell in love with the desert that I went out there on a serious survey trip looking for land in that mountain range that I'd been told about by these friends. And the first time I went out there, I had, as usual, I had this incredible experience that you know, I fell in love with that place, and I had gone to the BLM. The BLM is the agency that manages most of the federal land in the desert, and so I'd gone to their office, and I'd studied their maps, to plat maps and so forth, to see what the ownership patterns were out there. And so I picked out some pieces of private land that I might be interested in, and I rented a Jeep because my vehicle wasn't going to make it on these abandoned mining roads. This is a really remote mountain range that's only accessible via like utility roads, and then you take a dirt utility road for 20 miles, and then you get to an old mining road that's been abandoned for 100 years, and then you take that back into the mountains, and you get to these pieces of land I was interested in. So I did that, and you know, I mean, this was months of research, and you know, driving to San Bernardino, driving to Needles, and you know, I was living in San Francisco, and you know, writing people and calling people, and so I spent a week or so driving around looking at pieces of land that I found on these maps, and then using the ownership records of San Bernardino, the county office, I called the owners. I tried to contact the owners. Actually, I couldn't call them. I didn't have their phone numbers. So I wrote them all. I wrote like 30 some owners, and said, you know, I'm really interested in your land. You know, can you tell me more about it? Are you interested in selling, whatever? So, and that went on for 6 months or so. And then I got a call out of the blue. I was in San Francisco in my loft, and I was, you know, between band rehearsals or whatever. And I got this call 9 o'clock or 10 o'clock at night from this man who sounded like Methuselah. I mean, he said, Max, this is George Longthorn. You wrote me about my land. And this man was in his, he was in his 80s. He was pretty advanced with Alzheimer's, and he was living in Las Vegas. And he was interested in selling to me because I had come across as being sincere and as sincerely being in love with that place. And he turned out to be the owner of one of the two biggest properties in the mountains. And so, you know, we worked out a deal. He got his brother-in-law or nephew-in-law or something to handle the, you know, the details of the transaction, because George, his memory was reset every 5 minutes. You know, his Alzheimer's was so bad that 5 minutes after he started, he wouldn't remember you, and so you had to start over again. And anyway, I went to Las Vegas. I met him, and then I started the process with his relative, and I brought in a friend of mine from Los Angeles because I didn't have the money. I mean, I didn't have any money, but George didn't want very much for it. So, we worked it out. We borrowed, and my partner and I ended up buying that land, and that was back in 1990. And it just went from there. I mean, it was a land that was, to us, it was like owning your own national park. It was just, that's what my friend called it. He said, this is like owning our own national park, because it's this huge piece of land. It encompasses a canyon, a main canyon plus a bunch of side canyons. It goes from one peak to another with over 2,000 feet of surface relief, elevation changes. And it has a famous geological fault that goes through it. So it has all different kinds of incredible rock, and it has bighorn sheep, mountain lions, eagles. We've got all this amazing wildlife. Plus, we've got all these old mining ruins, and those are the kind of the downside of it. My friend kind of likes those. He's more into history, but yeah, that's how I came to find this land. And then, of course, I'm a seeker, and so I started spending time out there. I actually moved out there in 1992. I lived out there for a year on my land, and I tried to live off the land as much as I could, harvesting wild foods and learning about the seasons, and when things bear fruit and bear seed, and when things are ripe, and so forth. And I had some archaeologists that I'd met that gave me more information about how to use local resources, and how the Indians used local resources. So, that went on. And, in the process, that mountain range became my spiritual home. I mean, the desert in general is what I think of as my home, where my spirit goes to. And that mountain range, well, it turns out to be very sacred to Native peoples. So that sort of prepared me for meeting the Native people out there, and ultimately meeting my friend who's a Chemehuevi elder who put me in touch with you. So that's the story about my land.
That's very beautiful. It's a beautiful portrayal of the way that you see it, and it's a very nice description for our listeners, given that this is an audio medium. You're a great storyteller, and we really appreciate that. So let's talk about water, because part of the conversation that Matt and I had regarding you and that special place that we're not going to identify exactly, but can you share your thoughts on, as you said, the native way of life in the desert and what you've learned about it and the importance of water, particularly in that area?
Yeah, well, on the surface level, I think it's a no-brainer. I mean, everyone recognizes that if they didn't have, those taps and those faucets in their homes, they wouldn't be able to live there. That's, that's the level in which everyone's familiar with it. And that translates everywhere you go. When you go camping, um, you know, people who do sort of car camping, they take their water with them, or they expect to be able to get water at the campsite or the campground, whether they've made reservations or whatever. So they've got that relationship. But people who do what we call dispersed camping, where there's no facilities, or people who do backpacking, if they're only out for a few days, maybe they can just carry the water they need. Or if they're backpacking, and they're going out for a night, they can carry the water they need in their backpack, because they're not going to need more than a few quarts, a few liters. But if you're doing multi-day backpacks, then you have to rely on available water in the landscape and the habitat. And that's exactly what Native people did. They relied on local water sources. And of course, they were sharing them with wildlife. And the wildlife actually led them to water sources in many cases. You learn to read a landscape when you're living on that subsistence level. And from, sometimes from miles away, you can see vegetation that's going to identify surface water. You look across the landscape and you'll say, oh, there's cottonwoods over there, or there's willows over there, and those potentially represent surface water, or water that's near the surface. So that's the human thing. And then of course animals make paths to water if there are point sources. If you're living along a river where it's going hundreds of miles, it's no problem. There's water everywhere along that riparian pathway. But if you're in a place like the desert where water is incredibly scarce, um, there are typically point sources of water that are surrounded by huge areas that are dry. And so all the animals that rely on surface water are going to be making a beeline to those point sources, which we call springs or seeps, where water might be seeping out of a fracture zone, a crack in the rock, and just sort of trickling down. And those springs and seeps in the desert are not always standing. They don't always represent standing water. Sometimes they represent places where water is below the surface and you got to dig down to it. And animals will do that to get to the water, as well as people. And I like to think of people as originally learning from animals. And so birds, bighorn sheep, they will teach people where the water is, and they will teach people how to get it. And so this folk knowledge grows up among humans as it emerged among animals. And so there becomes this culture of water sources. And in the desert, one of the reasons why how I rationalize or how I justify my love of the desert, because so many times people say, oh, how can you love the desert? There's no water, you have to be around water. And so many people have said, well, I couldn't live away from the coast, or, my ideal habitat would be an island in the middle of the ocean surrounded by water. And I say, for me, it's just the opposite. I'm looking for something that's precious. I'm looking for a place where water is really precious, where it's not ubiquitous, where it's not everywhere, where you have to really work to find it. And of course, it's not just water. All the resources out there are hard to find, and you really have to know where to look for them. So that's what water means to me in the desert. The place you're talking about and the water resources out there, they're so incredibly complex, and they take, realistically, they take generations to understand. And you've got the Western, the colonial, the scientific approach to that, which we call hydrology, and is a branch of the earth sciences. And, people talk about how water migrates underground, between aquifers, and how it percolates down through soil and rock structures into an aquifer. And that's one way of looking at it. I actually have a scientist friend, a biologist, who has been out there for, well, since the 70s, so 50 years roughly, studying the wildlife out there. And one of the first things he did was to map the water sources. Well, the year in which he mapped the water sources in this entire mountain range turned out to be a very wet, unusually wet year. And he mapped roughly 80 water sources, point sources of water, like I was talking about, these springs or seeps where water appears, or where there are damp places and water could be found. He mapped roughly 80 of those across the whole mountain range. Those 80 sources don't exist like 90% of the time, or 99% of the time. That's the way the water is. I mean, I moved out there when I moved out there in 1992, it was another wet winter. And that's why I moved out there. I was working in the Bay Area, and I knew it was a wet winter. I could see that. And my friends who were living in the desert said, Max, you've got to come out here and see it. It's unbelievable. My mountain range had running streams all over the place. and there were these toads hatching out and singing, and um, I just couldn't believe it. I'd never seen anything like that. And of course, my love for the desert went up another notch because the desert is gifting us with this water that, it started in March and it lasted until July, and then the streams dried up. So that's the way it is in the desert. You get these miraculous things, these miraculous phenomena, and then they go away, and they're hiding. They might be hiding again for years. They might be hiding for decades. So water is like that in the desert. I know that you're involved with the water issues related to development in the desert, and it's a huge issue, and I've seen that unfold now for decades. That the people who are trying to do the development now, they started decades ago. They were out there when I was living out there, and I saw what they were doing at the time. They were doing agriculture out there, and they were pumping water from the underground aquifer, and everything's connected. I know that all these springs up in the mountains are, depending on the topography, they're going to be draining down into the aquifer. And there's a phenomenon with differences in elevation where if you're messing with the water downstream, it can draw down the levels upstream because it can accelerate the drainage. So I know that happens. These springs in the mountains can be affected by what they're doing downstream, for example, pumping, underground pumping. And it's incredibly complicated. I'm basically, my attitude to water use out there is the same as my attitude toward resource use everywhere. I'm against industrial use of resources. It's not sustainable. It's not sustainable anywhere. And we can see that in the archaeological record. We're finding more and more how these ancient civilizations fell because they overused their resources. So that's exactly what we're doing now, no question. So that's what ties our civilization to the natural phenomenon of water in a specific habitat.
Is that a warning? I mean, when we talk about climate, we talk about people like Catherine Hayhoe that speak very eloquently about the fragility of the human experience and our environment, and it always seems to take the form of a warning. So is that the way you feel about it?
Yeah, I'm not sure. I think you could phrase it in that way. I'm not sure that that's the only way to phrase it. I don't know how much we want to get into the larger issues of human culture, and what anthropologists would call material culture, how we use resources. I'm not the only one. There's thousands of people across the world now that are saying we're overusing resources and we're on the wrong path. I don't think I'm unique in warning about the consequences of that. I feel like we're doomed. I mean, that's my personal feeling based on what I've observed. I feel like we're doomed. It all fits in with the way we interact with nature and each other. We're a very violent society. We're a very exploitative society. And it goes back to our roots in Imperial Europe. And these sort of fundamental institutions that we brought here from Europe that are fundamentally destructive. There's a lot of well-known stories, legends, myths among indigenous people in the Western Hemisphere about the destroyers, people like us in our civilization who come to destroy. And I've taken that to heart.
Well, I'm glad you brought that up. And especially the European tendency has demonstrated so far to be rather destructive. And I mean, rather, in a very gentle way. Um, it kind of leads to the discussion of trauma, like you mentioned that briefly too, about how what we're bringing, in our emotional constructs of self, and being able to release that trauma. And that's why we did recent broadcast down with South American traditional healers, to investigate indigenous means of releasing trauma memory. Do you want to comment about that loosely in the general sense or in the specific sense about how we can improve our lives by working on us and letting nature work on nature?
Yeah, well, everyone has their own take on that. And I mean, I have a Native American friend who goes out to the desert because he sees it as a healing landscape. That's how he talks about it. That's the story he tells. He says that he goes out there and the place heals him. And I know that's happened for me. I know it's been happening all along, and it's if I can if I can get away from the kind of the mystical language that we're forced to use around that. When I first started going camping in the desert, and I made those trips from San Francisco, these all-day trips out to the desert with my girlfriend, and we get out there, and when I got out there, we'd sit outside of our cave where we were camping, and there was a mountain, there was a peak. The desert was open, but there was a peak that was the landmark in our view from our cave, and it was maybe 10 miles away. And when I first arrived, I would sit there looking at that peak, and my eyes wouldn't be able to focus because back in the city, I had been, focusing short range. I had been reading, I had been staring at my computer screen. And so I couldn't focus at that, 10-mile distance or whatever it was. But after 3 days, my focus returned. The desert had retrained my vision. So I was able to pick out individual strata, the colors of individual strata in that mountain, in that peak. And that's one very concrete, very practical way in which the desert can heal people, in which nature can heal people. And anybody can understand that, because we've all had vision issues at one time or another. So it's not just this sort of, vague spiritual feeling of, oh, I'm feeling better, I'm feeling more relaxed, more natural or whatever, because I'm in the desert, but it's physical too. And, if you're camping in the desert, if you're trying to get close to it, if you're trying to get close to nature, it forces you to be more active. It forces you to use all of your senses. All of your senses are healed